Welcome to the 2019 Global Swine Benchmark Report, sponsored by Merck Animal Health. I'm Dr. Daryl Holtkamp, and I'm a professor in the Department of Veterinary Diagnostic and Production Animal Medicine at Iowa State University. Before I begin, I want to thank my collaborators on this project, Drs. Lee Schultz and Dermot Hayes, both in the Department of Economics at Iowa State University. I'm going to address two questions for you today. Who are the world's best pork producers? And second, what are the factors then that give producers in each country a competitive advantage or disadvantage? We're also going to address year-over-year changes comparing 2019 to 2018. The 2019 is the most recent data that we have available. And so we'll be comparing changes from that year compared to 2018. The raw data for the analysis came primarily from an international benchmarking network known as Interpig. And in this slide, you can see the countries that are contributing to that network, mostly in Europe, North American countries as well, and then Brazil and South America. For Brazil, they contribute two data points, one for Mato Grosso and one for the state of Santa Catarina, due to the differences in the production systems in those two states. So the way Interpig operates is that the representatives in each country then use production and financial data from farm records to measure average performance of representative swine farms in each country. And they meet once a year to ensure cross-country comparisons that are as accurate as possible. This year they did that virtually. Definitions then are standardized, and so they do that so they can assure that the comparisons they're making are apples to apples. And then the data presented here, as I mentioned, is for 2019, the most recently available. Notably absent, though, in the Interpig database is information for countries in Asia or some major or key importing countries in general. And so to overcome that, we used Merck Animal Health technical marketing and sales staff to help us collect some representative data for those two countries, for China and Japan in Asia. The data for Japan then came primarily from published sources, including the Agriculture and Livestock Industries Corporation, as well as the Japanese Ministry for Agriculture, Fisheries, and Forestry. For China, there's less publicly available information, so we had to rely on getting information directly from producers and veterinarians in that country. And as a consequence, then we had to focus on a specific segment of that market. And for that, we focused on the modern, large-scale, single-story, non-filtered hog farms that is free of African swine fever. And so it's important to keep in mind then that the values that are being reported for China are not necessarily representative of all producers in that country, but rather specifically for that segment of the production. And so then we developed then a production and economic model to estimate the productivity, cost, revenue, and profit using the data provided by Interpig and the data obtained for China and Japan. And you can see a screenshot of that model here. It was built in Excel, and we modeled each phase of production individually, but then for this analysis, and for what I'll report today to you, is for the combined breed to market phase of production, so all phases combined. And you can see here then that each column represents here, or there's a column for each country, and of course that it would extend to the right for the rest of the countries here to the right of this screenshot here. So to the first question then, who are the world's best pork producers? In this slide, what we're reporting here is the orange bars represent the total cost of production. The line represents the market pig prices. And then the blue shaded area here represents the total profit in each country. The vertical axes, then the units for that are in dollars per kilogram carcass weight. And so you can see then that Japan and China have the highest total cost of production here, followed by Italy. And that's largely driven by Italy's production of very large white hogs for a premium branded ham market. On the other end of the scale, producers in Brazil, US, and Canada have the lowest cost of production. Looking at market pig prices here, you can see a strong correlation with the total cost of production. So countries that have high cost of production also have high market pig prices, and vice versa. Countries with low market pig prices or low total cost of production tend to have low market pig prices. And so very strong positive correlation then between cost of production and market pig prices. So looking at the same chart, but focusing now on the profit the blue shaded area here, you can see that net profit in 2019 was highest in Japan and China. With the exception of a few countries in Europe, here nearly every country was profitable in 2019. And looking at year-over-year changes in that then, 2019 versus 2018, we can see in this fourth column here the changes in net profit year over year. And in general, with the exception of Japan, all countries were more profitable in 2019. The simple average increase in profitability was 22 cents per kilogram carcass weight. That was driven largely by an increase in market pig prices in most countries, especially in China here, with a very large increase in pig prices in that country, largely driven by African swine fever and the supply shortages that resulted. In other countries, probably also largely being attributed to the higher imports in China. While they were not importing near what they are today, as we sit in 2021. They were beginning to ramp up imports even in 2019, and that's reflected, I think, to a large extent here in some of the increasing prices we saw in every country in the world, or at least in the database that we are looking at here. And then with the exception of China and Japan, the total cost of production here in the second column were also lower in 2019, and on average, those total costs declined by 4 cents per kilogram of carcass weight here on a simple average of all countries. And this is primarily driven by a reduction in feed costs, as shown in here in the third column, and the only exception there being in China, where feed costs were increasing in 2019. So to the second question, then, what are the factors that give countries a competitive advantage or disadvantage? And in this slide, we're looking at the total kilograms of pork produced on a per breeding female per year basis here in the orange shaded area. And that is plotted here on the right axis. The gray bars represent the average live weight at market. And then the line down here represents the number of pigs marketed per breeding female per year. And both of those here then are plotted on the left axis. And so you can see then that Italy leads in terms of total carcass weight produced per breeding female per year. And again, that's largely driven by the very heavy weights they market their pigs at, again, for that premium branded ham market. The Netherlands and Denmark lead the way in terms of productivity with the highest number of pigs marketed per breeding female per year. And then China at the other end of the scale lags in that measure. So again, Japan and China both relatively low productivity on in terms of the number of pigs marketed per breeding female per year, which then leads to a very low, relatively low amount of pork or kilograms of pork marketed per year. Their average market weights tend to be relatively average compared to other countries, so that lower market weight produced or lower kilograms of pork produced is driven almost exclusively by the lower productivity. Look at the year-over-year changes then in productivity here. We can see that in this far right column here, productivity increased in most countries in terms of the kilograms of pork produced per female per year. That was driven to some extent both by the number of pigs marketed as well as live weights. If you look at the number of pigs marketed per female per year here in the first column, you can see that the largest improvement occurred here in Hungary in 2019 relative to 2018. The biggest declines occurred at the other end of the scale here in Japan and China. And those declines, again, were likely indirectly the result of problems with African swine fever, at least here, especially in China here. And by indirectly, I mean changes in the production that occurred because of the African swine fever, again, led to some challenges in that country for productivity, or that resulted in lower productivity. And then in the second column here, we can see the changes in average live weights from year to year. Largest increase in market weights occurred in Hungary as well as in China here. And again, China, this is likely driven primarily by the African swine fever impact of that disease there in the country. Again, that producers that could get pigs to market tended to take them a little bit to heavier weights to take advantage of the higher pig prices caused by the shortage in pork produced in the country starting in 2019 as a result of the African swine fever introduced in late 2018. And so this chart looks at the factors that give producers a leg up over producers in other countries. Basically, what we're looking at here, then the values in each cell represent an advantage or disadvantage in terms of profit that result both overall in the first column here, as well as the individual factors here in the table for each of these market pig prices, feed prices, and so forth. And we'll look at the individual factors in more detail in the subsequent slides. For this slide, I do want to highlight, first of all, what the meaning of each number in the cell, and then a couple other things. The values in the cell represent then the advantage that country has over a hypothetical average country, given that factor or attributed to that factor. In the first column, it's overalls. And so if we look at that first column here, we can see that China had a very large profit advantage of $1.24 per kilogram carcass weight over a hypothetical average country in 2019. The biggest disadvantage went to producers in Ireland, where they had a 29-cent disadvantage to producers in a hypothetical average country. And so if you look at the gap between China and the best, who had the highest advantage, and producers in Ireland with the lowest advantage, you have a $1.53 gap between those two in terms of their profitability. And the other thing I want to point out then is the shading behind the numbers has meaning. So positive numbers, again, are shaded green. That indicates a competitive advantage. Red negative numbers indicated a competitive disadvantage, and those are shaded red. And so the darker the green or the darker the red, the bigger the absolute value of those numbers. And so you can just hopefully see just by looking at this where the biggest sources of the competitive advantage or disadvantage arise. And so, as I promised, we'll look into each one of these factors in a little more detail. So we'll start with market pig prices here. The figure here just simply shows the market pig prices by country with the bars here. And then again, this is in US dollars per kilogram of carcass weight. And then the red line here represents the average for simple average for all countries in 2019. And so you can see that Japan and China benefited the most from high pig prices. That gave them in China, for example, a $2.24 advantage over a hypothetical average country. And then Canada and the Americas were at the Canada, Brazil, and the U.S. The Americas were at the bottom, having relatively high relative disadvantage in terms of profitability because of the relatively low market pig prices. Looking at feed prices here, then the chart here up to the right shows the red bar is the weighted average diet price in the sow herd, whereas the green bar represents the weighted average diet price in the wean to finish phase of production. And then the lines again represent a simple average for all countries. The units on the vertical axis here then are in US dollars per metric ton of feed. And so we can see then that this chart looks a little bit as if it were just flipped from the previous table with market pig prices. And so those countries, again, with high feed prices tend to be at the bottom here now, where on the previous slide they were on the top because of relatively high market pig prices. But you can see Japan and China, again, have a relatively large competitive disadvantage because of the high feed prices in those countries. Now the Americas, though, Canada, Brazil, US, and we have Finland in there from Europe now, have a relatively large competitive advantage now because of their lower feed prices. And then looking at productivity here, the chart to the right, the red bars represent the number of pigs weaned per female per year. The green bar represents the number of pigs weaned per female per year. And so you can see here then the difference between these two then would reflect the wean to market mortality. And again, the lines represent simple averages for these for all the countries. And so there's two other factors that we looked at, or two other productivity measures we looked at that are not represented on this in this figure, and that would be the average daily gain and feed conversion from wean to market. And so everything essentially that we consider for productivity is reflected here except those two measures. All of the measures, including the average daily gain and feed conversion, then are represented in the table to the left here. And so based on productivity for all those measures, Denmark and the Czech Republic and the Netherlands lead the way in terms of productivity, and that gives them a relative competitive advantage here. At the other end of the scale, you have, again, China and Japan, because of the relatively low productivity, have a competitive advantage because of that fact, a disadvantage because of that factor. And then looking at fixed cost here, again, the chart to the right, these are a fixed cost on a per breeding female per year basis. And again, the line represents simple average of all countries here. And so you can see that then the table to the right reflects those same values here, where you have the high cost, high countries with high fixed cost. Here, Austria, Italy, Sweden at the bottom have a relative competitive disadvantage because of that. And then because of the low fixed cost in Brazil, Canada, Spain, US, and China, they have a relative competitive advantage in terms of profit because of their low fixed cost. And then finally, we looked at labor. We looked at labor usage as well as wage rates independently, and then combine those as a total labor cost here together in the first column here. The table figure to the right here shows the labor usage, the red bars for each country, and then the blue line represents the wage rates. And the units for the labor usage is on the left axis here in terms of hours per breeding female per year. And then on the right axis is the labor cost in dollars per hour. And so you can see that countries with relatively low wage rates tend to use more labor, and so have a bit lower labor productivity in terms of the number of hours they use per breeding female per year. A couple exceptions to that would be the Spain and US over here, for example, have relatively low wage rates, but also then have very high labor productivity in terms of represented by the fact that they use relatively little labor per breeding female per year. And so when we combine all of those in the table to the right here, you can see that overall, Brazil, Belgium, US, Spain, China benefit from relatively low labor costs overall. For some countries, that's driven by relatively low labor usage or efficient use of labor. In other countries, it's driven by relatively low wage rates. For example, in Brazil, here in both Mato Grosso and Santa Catarina. At the other end of the scale, you have Italy, Japan, Austria with, again, either relatively high labor usage or in some cases, high wage rates as well, for example, in Austria. And so, again, you can see that each country then either benefits either from low labor usage or high wage rate or low wage rates or vice versa here. And the combined effect then gives them a relative competitive advantage or disadvantage in terms of profitability here represented in that first column. All right, so now we're back to the table we started with here. And again, and I want to highlight this table only here to demonstrate that hopefully visually you can see that the background colors or the values are larger, either negative or positive for market pig prices, feed prices, and productivity. And so what that means then is that the factors then that contributed the most to the relative advantage or disadvantage then were those three factors. And so fixed cost, labor usage, and wage rates, while not insignificant factors for affecting profitability, relatively they contributed less, had less impact on the profitability or relative advantage and disadvantage in each country than these three market pig and feed prices and productivity factors. So to summarize then, who are the world's best pork producers? Well, the lowest cost producers are in Brazil and countries in North America. The highest cost producers are in Asia. Europe's in the middle, but it also has the world's most productive producers in terms of kilograms of pork produced per breeding female per year. What factors gave countries a competitive advantage or disadvantage? Market pig prices, feed prices, and productivity were the factors that contributed the most to a country's relative advantage or disadvantage. And it's also important to point out, again, that countries with high feed costs tend to have relatively high market pig prices. And so the countries with high costs overall, high feed costs especially, are not necessarily the countries that are the least profitable and vice versa. In fact, in 2019, Japan and China with the highest total overall costs were also the most profitable. And then how did 2019 compare to 2018? Producers in nearly every country were more profitable in 2019. Market pig prices were higher, as well as feed costs remained low and declined in most countries. And so the other factor that contributed to increased profitability to some extent then was improved productivity and market weights in some countries. With that, I want to thank again the Merck Animal Health for funding the study, and especially the assistance of the following individuals for helping collect data in Japan and China. Dr. Hong Lin, who's with MSD Animal Health in the Asia Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa regions, Di Gao, who's with MSD Animal Health in China, and Soichi Okada, who's with MSD in Japan. Thank you.